Hi there, this is Rich Troxler, aka Rich Trox. In this video, I'll be talking about chunking the open beach for striped bass. But before I begin, I want to address a couple points. First, I've received messages and emails asking why I don't show video of me catching fish. There are several reasons really, but first and foremost is that I'm trying to cram an enormous amount of info into my videos in as short a period of time as possible. Even then, my videos are still fairly long. Video of me catching and landing a fish doesn't really teach you anything, and there's already plenty of fish catching videos on the internet. That being said, I recently purchased a GoPro camera and will be adding some fish catching video to future videos, just for entertainment purposes if nothing else. You're watching some of my first test run videos with the camera now, making bait and catching small redfish in a local Virginia beach bay. Another item I want to touch upon. The information I provide in my videos is not intended to be the be-all and end-all of fishing. It's not about self-promotion, it's just my version of fishing based on my 40+ years of experience in the sport. The sole purpose of my videos is to stimulate thought, provide direction, and pay a little something forward to a sport that is giving me so much enjoyment in my life. So if you or your crew do something different than I do, and it works for you, then that's fine. It's all good. Now that that's out of the way, let's get back on topic. So you have your cooler over your shoulder, your rod in hand, and you're walking out onto the beach. First, unless you absolutely know to the contrary, you should be fishing the higher stages of the tide. Yes, there are beaches where you can walk out past a bar and catch fish, but I'm talking in general here. So go with the percentages and start with the higher stages of the tide, particularly at night. Incoming water is generally easier to read than outgoing water, so I like to do my explorations on the incoming. If you are not sure what reading the beach and beach structure is all about, please check out my other videos on the subject, as I won't be explaining what they are and how to find them in this video. Assuming you know what you are looking at, get to your first piece of promising structure. Typical structure would be one or more of the following: a sandbar with a trough, a sandbar trough configuration with one or more cuts in the bar, a pronounced hole, a series of smaller holes, and points with holes on one or both sides. It's important to identify the type of structure you are fishing, as the layout of any given structure determines how to approach fishing it. I'll cover each structure in sequence, but there are a few loose ends to talk about first. The first is cutting and hooking bunker. Easy enough for those that know, but for those new to the technique, here you go. Smaller bunker will typically yield 3 pieces in a head, while larger bunker will get you 4 pieces in a head. Each piece has a purpose. I usually do not start with the head and throw it back in the cooler for when needed. I'll explain why in a bit, so just start with the middle piece. When using middle pieces, I make no attempt to keep the guts in, and they usually just fly off when I cast. If you want to use a rubber band or some other method of keeping the guts in place, have at it. When hooking the chunk, you want the hook deep enough and above the backbone, but not too deep. You want enough hook points showing to ensure a good hook set. That's one of the things I like about Siwash hooks. When the hook point comes through, always make sure there are no scales stuck on the point. Don't worry about the fish seeing your hook. Striped bass are not hook shy. When hooking the head, run your hook sideways through the meat on the back of the neck. Some hook through the lips, but I've had bad luck with the hook not pulling out cleanly and rehooking the head and losing the fish. I'll mostly fish middle pieces, but there's a couple reasons why I might switch to head or tail pieces. First, the tail piece. There are times when I'm getting what feels like bass hits, but not hooking up. After missing a few, I will sometimes tie on a smaller hook and use a smaller tail piece. If I hook a small bass or blue, this tells me what I need to know, and for me this means 3 possible courses of action. The first is to stay put, fish with a smaller hook and tail piece, and catch small bass, and hope that a bigger bass will show up and eat the small offering. The second is stay put, fish with heads which are too big for the smaller bass, and hope some bigger fish show and eat the heads. And the third is to move to another location and start prospecting all over again. I fish the heads when I feel some big fish might be in the area, or if I'm picking at decent-sized fish on middle pieces, I'll mix a head in just to keep it honest. That's the skinny on bunker, so now let's talk about hooking the bass. I'll start by saying that I don't spike my rod when chunking, and there are 2 reasons for this. The first reason is personal. I love the adrenaline rush I get when a bass picks up the chunk. Why would I want to rob myself of that feeling by having my rod spiked? The second reason is purely practical. If you were laying out good money for fresh bunker to catch bass, you don't want to waste it on less desirable species like skates and dogfish. When you hold your rod, you learn what different pickups feel like so you can take action to avoid hooking them. Here's a summary of what some species feel like when they come for your chunk. These are generalizations and there can be exceptions. Striped bass will typically just pick up the bait and run, usually laterally. Brown sharks, also known as sandbar sharks, will pick up the chunk and usually run in toward the beach, so you have to reel fast to catch up with them. Big bluefish will usually bite at it quickly once or twice before taking off with your chunk. Smaller blues will peck at it for a longer time than their bigger brothers. Dogfish will feel like bluefish bites except softer, if that makes any sense. Takes them a little longer to get the whole chunk in. Skates kind of maul your chunk. They don't hit and run. They have small mouths, so it takes them a while. You know there's life at the end of your line. It just doesn't go anywhere fast. So if you are holding your rod, you learn to identify what's at the other end of your line. If you feel a skate or dogfish messing with your bait, just crank in 5 or 6 fast turns to move the bait. This saves your bait and sometimes triggers a strike from a bass that may be in the area. After I make my cast, I will usually stand on the highest point on the sand with my rod held in the 12 to 1 o'clock position. I want as much of my line out of the water as possible to minimize the effects of wave action and to give me better feel. If conditions permit, meaning the waves are not too large or the sweep too strong, I like to leave a little slack in my line. Not much, but a little if possible, so that the bass can suck up the chunk without resistance. Too tight a line can mean a drop chunk. When I feel the bass pick up and go, I immediately drop my rod parallel to the beach, and then set the hook when the line comes tight. If the bass is motivated, it won't take long, and sometimes they practically rip the rod out of your hands. Once the bass is hooked, let the rod and the drag do the work. If the bass wants to run, let her go. There's nothing to cut you off on. Just keep the line tight, the rod up, and let the rod and the reel's drag wear her down. Once you have the bass close to shore, it's time to seal the deal. Many a dream has been crushed here, so stay calm and follow these guidelines. Don't try to horse the fish in. You and your gear are no match for the power of ocean waves. Use the waves to your advantage by walking backwards quickly and letting the wave push the fish onto the beach. If the fish isn't ready yet, see guideline number 1. With each wave, apply a little pressure, and if the fish starts sliding in with the wave, walk backwards quickly, keeping the pressure on until the wave starts to recede. If the fish beaches, get to it quick before another wave comes and washes it back down into the surf. Reel in your slack line as you move toward the fish. You don't want to be getting tangled up in fishing line, and if you lose the race with the next wave, you're going to want to make sure you're still connected to your fish. If the fish does not beach and starts sliding back down with a receding wave, move right back down with it. Let it go. Don't try to stop it, particularly if it's a big fish. This is especially important on beach fronts with sharp slopes to them, as water runs quickly backwards and creates tremendous pressures. Take your time, work with the waves, and you will have your prize. Knowing how to fish various structures is easier if you know how bass relate to them. So let's start there. You can't talk to a bass, so when fishermen discuss bass behavior, what we are doing is making conclusions based on long-term observation and general consensus, otherwise known as, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. This is the best we can do, generalizations and educated guesses, with nothing etched in stone. So let me get quacking. Here are some things to think about presented in no particular order, and yes, there are exceptions. Striped bass like to have a little water over their heads. If there is 3 feet of water next to 5 feet of water, bass will most probably be in the 5-foot water. Bass relate to edges. If 3 feet of water drops straight off to 5 feet of water, then bass will probably be right at that edge in 5 feet of water. Bass use edges as ambush points, cruising along them, using them as cover to get close to prey. They also use them as current breaks, convenient places to lay out of the current while letting prey items get washed to them. And lastly, they use them as pinpoints, places where they pin bait up against or corral them into. Bass spend more time on or near the bottom than they do on the surface. Yes, they do attack bait on the surface, but they spend most of their time near the bottom. Bass are either actively feeding or neutral. Blitzes are an event and not the norm. Normal active feeding is usually far less obvious than blitzes. It occurs when conditions meet the bass's fancy, whatever they may be. The rest of the time they're cruising around in neutral mode. They'll eat if the opportunity presents itself, but won't work too hard for it. Small bass and big bass don't tend to travel together. Small bass are busybodies. They have a lot of growing to do, so they run around eating everything they can. Big bass are a different animal entirely. They're older, smarter, more set in their ways, and far more selective than their younger versions. They may show up briefly where small bass are feeding, but they don't hang with the little guys. So let's take some casts and see how the above generalizations apply. Sandbar trough configurations are plentiful on some stretches of beaches and woefully absent on others. They, like most beach structure, will probably be best fished at the higher stages of the tide, when there is enough water to bring fish in. The ideal configuration is a sandbar reachable with a cast, with a steep backside drop into a trough of 2 foot or more. Unfortunately, they're pretty hard to find, so we'll start there and work to the more common variations. The simple version is to put your bait as close to the backside drop of the sandbar as possible. Bass love edges, and they like a little water over their heads. So let's look at how the bass get into a trough. There are really only 2 ways. Either they come over the bar, or they come in through a cut and hang a left or right. If it's a long bar with no cuts, then the only way in is to run the bar, which means there has to be enough water on the bar at the higher stages of the tide to allow the bass to get over the bar and into the trough. My guess is you need at least 3 feet of water on the bar in order for the bass to run it. So if the bar you are fishing is very shallow with no cuts in the bar, then find another bar to fish. If the bar has cuts and the trough is reasonably deep, then fish near the cuts. Try one side, and if nothing happens, try the other side. If fish are in the area, then they will pass through there on their way in, typically on the incoming tide, and then again on their way out at some point during the outgoing tide. Many long sandbars have multiple cuts along their length, so fish as many as possible until you find some fish. When there are long offshore sandbars not reachable with a cast, try to fish near the cuts in the bar, for the same reasons as mentioned previously. And where troughs are concerned, you want to find the deepest water you can fish. I like to put my bait in 6 foot of water or more when possible. It may not be available where you are fishing, and you can catch in less, but water depth is one of the things I look for in a spot. As I previously mentioned, you can catch bass in shallow water, and in many situations frequently will. But the key to this is the bass having access to deeper water. The most common structure this happens on is the lip, the area just behind where a wave breaks on shore. Bass will frequently cruise the lip to see what the waves are digging up, but again, only in areas with access to deeper water. Shallow water with shallow troughs may look good, but if the water depth isn't there, then keep looking for another area to fish. So in practical terms, this is how I would fish these various configurations. If I can reach the bar, I cast up onto it and pull my bait off the backside into the trough. This can be tricky to do by feel at night. Most times you will be fishing with 5 to 8 ounces of lead, depending upon the conditions. That much weight tends to drag the bottom on slow retrieve, which means your weight will slide down the backside of the bar and into the trough, and you won't really feel any difference. The solution is to lift the rod and retrieve quickly to get the weight off the bottom. And when you stop your retrieve, it takes a second or two to hit the bottom, then you know you went off the drop. Practicing over flat bottom to get a feel for how long it takes to hit bottom when you stop your quick retrieve will help you identify when you go off a drop. You get grooved to the half second or so drop on flat bottom. So when you stop your retrieve and it takes 1.5 seconds before you feel your sinker touch down, it becomes very noticeable. So I put my bait in the trough, right up against the drop if possible. Because that is a high traffic area for bass, I'll wait around 5 minutes or so to see if there are any takers. Then I'll reel in about 8 or 10 quick cranks of the handle and wait a minute or so. Sometimes the quick lift and crank gets the attention of a bass closing in on the scent, prompting a hit right after you stop reeling. If nothing happens, I repeat the process, but wait a shorter time span until I get near shore. If the trough is deep, it probably has a pronounced lip, so I let the bait stay there for a few minutes before reeling in and changing the bait. I change baits about every 10 minutes, and unlike some, I do throw the old chunk into the water. My version is that a couple of free pieces of bunker is not going to fill a bass's stomach up, but may get them snooping around in the lip a little bit more. If the bar has a cut, then I would fish there first. Cast near where the cut comes through the bar if you can reach it. Fish both sides and then move in a little ways along the back side of the bar. Sometimes there are little underwater points and coves off the back of the cut that the bass are holding on, so it pays to move around a little bit. Fish it the same way as previously described, moving your bait frequently and fishing all the way into the lip. If the sandbar system is offshore well beyond your cast, fish near the cuts if they are present and spend more time fishing the lip area of the shore. It's the closest structure to you, and if the water is fairly deep near shore, then bass will have no problem coming right up on it, particularly at night. Lastly, if the stretch of beach you are fishing has only one small sandbar on it and no other available structure like holes in the area, then stick to it and fish it hard, as that is really the only game in town. If bass are around, then sooner or later they will be in that area. I have a fairly short attention span at times, so if nothing happens in 20 minutes or so at any given spot, and I know there is other structure in the area, then I'll go give it a try. Many times I'll go back and forth between 2 or 3 pieces of structure until I find fish, or I'm satisfied there are no fish around, or the receding tide renders the pieces of structure unfishable. Holes and points are probably the most common structure on most beaches. They also tend to be the most overlooked because they are not always easy to identify. Sometimes there are a few big deeper holes within walking distance of each other. Sometimes there are a series of smaller holes, more like scalloped areas of shoreline, one after another. And frequently, there is a hole on one or both sides of a point. Regardless of where you find them, they are fairly easy to fish. I typically guesstimate where the left side of the hole is and make a long cast straight out. I'll let the bait sit for maybe 3 minutes and then bring the bait in 7 or 8 cranks, let it sit for a minute, and repeat until I get into the shore break. I'll let the bait sit for a few minutes at the lip before cranking in and putting on a fresh chunk. I then take 10 or so steps to the right and repeat the whole process. I'll continue to do this until I think I've reached the right side of the hole. Pay attention to how long it takes for your sinker to hit bottom on a cast, as that clues you in to where the edges of the hole are. If there are a series of alternating holes and small points on a beach, which is very common, then I'll take a cast or two at each one using the same retrieve process as described above. I'll keep moving down the beach until I find fish or run out of bait. Sometimes you stumble on a deeper hole that didn't make itself apparent through wave observation, and it pays to stay there a little longer. If there's an obvious prominent point, then there is likely a hole on one of its sides. These are usually pretty good places to fish because it provides bass some deeper water over their heads and a way into and away from the structure. It also gives them an edge to follow, some current flow as water washes off the bar after the waves break, and a great place to corral bait fish up in. Start by casting up onto the edge of the point and work the bait in. Then cast a few degrees toward the deeper water of the hole and work the bait in. Move around the whole area until you start connecting with fish or you are satisfied that none are around. Throughout this video, I stress moving around a lot, and there is a reason for this. Most ocean beaches have prevailing currents or sweep, which is basically the sideways movement of water. There are many reasons for these currents, but that's another story for another time. Because of these currents, the scent of your bait is only being carried in one direction. Any bass upcurrent of your bait will never get a sniff. An example of this would be several bass lined up on the edge of a point, facing into the current, sucking up sand fleas, crabs, or anything else that gets washed off the shallow breaking water. If you are casting your bait 30 feet down current, in other words behind them, then you could probably sit there all night without a bite, whereas a small move to put your bait up on the edge they're patrolling can result in bass finding your bait. This is why I move around when I chunk, and when I do move, it's typically up current of my previous location. A quick word about bites. As mentioned earlier, blitzes are a lot of fun when they happen, but they are not the norm. Most times when bass get hungry, they'll start nosing around eating basically anything they can get their mouths around. Even when they're neutral, they'll still eat a chunk of fresh bunker if they come across it. But predicting when they'll go on the feed, in other words bite, is akin to trying to predict the weather. Yes, there are lots of generalizations like dawn and dusk, tidal stages, lunar stages, wind directions and speed, etc. But you can't put this stuff into a matrix and predict exactly when bass will bite. Absent of special conditions like a classic nor'easter at Montauk Point, day-to-day chunking is a grind. You're trying to find fish around particular structures, determine if the bite is a day, night, or both bite, and figure out what stage of the tide the bite happens and how long it lasts. Ocean bites might last a couple of days or a week or more. You just don't know. When the bite dies, you have to go and find them again, or wait until the next batch comes up the beach. Bass on the open beach move around a lot. When they're neutral, they may decide to move to deeper water and just hang around outside of your fishing range. Most times when the tide gets too low, they head out to deeper water and become unavailable again. Bass do what they want on their own time clock, so there are no hard and fast rules about catching them. The most you can do is increase your odds of being in the right place at the right time. And that's basically my plan when I leave the door to go chunking for striped bass. I try to increase my odds of being in the right place at the right time. Here's the short version of things I consider important. Fish the freshest bunker you can find. It's worth the effort to find it and take good care of it. Learn to identify productive structure. Fishing in flat-bottom, shallow water is not going to get you into bass. Stick to the higher stages of the tide. Last 2 hours of the in and first 2 hours of the out is a good place to start. Hold your rod and pay attention. It's important to learn what all the local species feel like when they are on your bait. You can't do that with your rod and a sand spike. Move your bait often. Don't let it sit in one place for half an hour while you stare off into space. Work your bait all the way into shore and stay engaged in the process. Change your bait often. The fresher the piece of bait, the easier it is for Mr. Bass to track it down. Don't grow roots. Make lots of small moves, and if you have several structures around, rotate through them. Don't get lazy. So that pretty much sums up my approach to fishing bunker chunks for striped bass on the open beach. Fishing is a lifelong learning process, a journey if you will, so buckle up and enjoy the ride. That's my view from the beach, so until next time, be well and catch 'em up.